Welcome to the My Narrative podcast. I'm your host, Yafa Aris. The following is a conversation with Charles Radclyffe. Charles is a serial entrepreneur who has focused his career on solving tough technology challenges for some of the world's largest organizations. He's an experienced public speaker, having presented at various events in the UK, US, and the Middle East on the philosophical questions around smart devices, data science, and artificial intelligence industry, and the societal impact of the application of this technology. Afternoon, Charles. How are you?
Hey, very good, thank you. Very good. Nice to be here.
Yeah, welcome to the My Narrative podcast. So let's dive right into it. Maybe would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Charles Radclyffe. I'm somebody who has spent my entire life worrying about technology and at the same time being excited by it. And after many, many years, that's led me to setting up a company called Ethics Grade. And we provide data essentially to investors on how ethical tech companies are. But we also make all of our data available for free to everyone else. So that's what we do.
Sweet. So I think your, areas of interest or / expertise evolve around AI, automation, robotics. So what are your views on, these broad themes and how they could change or challenge our assumptions on how we live and, in the core of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis in our societies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's something really quite magical about AI and automation and robotics. And I guess the thing that I would try to say to everyone listening is that we have to look at these technologies as being fundamentally different to everything that we've used before, come across before. And there's a really, really simple reason why that's true. And I'll come on to and explain that in a second. But I think if we just simply look through the same lens that we've always looked through, then we're gonna fall into some really dangerous traps. And I'm really keen to make sure that we don't do that. And the reason I think that this technology is so different to what we've had before is if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution from 200 years ago through to the 20th century, all the technologies that changed the world, so like steam engines and airplanes and even everything including kind of Google search engine and mobile phones and all these sort of things, all of these capabilities extended our capabilities as humans. They were things that could lift more, carry more, push more, count more. And really, when you look at robotics and AI technology, the difference between those two things is we are largely replicating human abilities in machines. We're looking at what we can do, and we're finding potentially more efficient ways or safer ways of doing it using a machine. And that just fundamentally changes everything. That changes the game entirely, both in terms of the future of work, the nature of work we have, but also in terms of how we interact with machines and what responsibility they have for us and what responsibility we have for them.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Charles. So it's a sort of natural evolution, extension, amplification of the human capabilities, but it's the interplay between us humans and technology. So what would be, like you mentioned just now, sometimes we tend to just focus on the hype and then the crazy movies and all the media around it. So what would be the sort of common myth that you would like to debunk via your work and things that you are involved right now?
Yeah, well, I think just to come back on that, I think it is about amplification in some respects in terms of scale. It's true that but it's really it's not about augmentation of what we do. It's about replicating what we do. And I think this is so clear to me, being somebody who works in the field, that so much of the value that's found from AI, and I guess maybe this is the myth I would debunk, much of the value that we're finding is about looking at how we humans solve problems and finding a way of machine solving the same problem. And that's just so different to technologies in the past where it didn't really matter how we did things. That was irrelevant. It was about extending our capability. So the past technologies were about expanding our set of things we could do. We can build the Empire State Building because we can carry more steel than a man or a woman can carry, because we have cranes and we have, pulleys and levers and all of the technology that goes into this. But what a robotics company does, if you look at what Amazon is implementing into its warehouses, these are machines which are designed to have the level of dexterity that you or I have, are designed to pick up an object, spot that it's picked up the right object and put it into a box, and then to seal that box. That is a very human level of ability. So I think that's where the transformative impact really comes. And maybe that's the biggest myth. I would say the other myth, which would be fun, kind of maybe speaking about the limitations of AI. There's a lot of nonsense written about artificial general intelligence and super intelligence and all of these things. For me, those are kind of science fiction questions, so not really sensible debate about what we can do this year, next year, or the year after. They're interesting, don't get me wrong, and I think it's a fascinating subject to consider, but I think most of us don't really have to worry about those types of scenarios. The really important thing about particularly machine learning to bear in mind is that there's a very natural boundary in terms of what this stuff can do, and that boundary is the limit of data and compute and the energy costs associated with those two things. So the more data you have, the more computation that needs to go into processing that data, the more electricity essentially that is used to be able to perform that function. And while computers are getting more and more efficient over time, they are like many orders of magnitude less efficient than us. So I've had a bowl of cereal and a salad for lunch, and I'm still able to do quite a lot of complex tasks this afternoon. Okay, I've had a few coffees as well, but my energy consumption today is measured in hundreds of calories, or maybe 1,500 calories so far. Okay, I'll have a big dinner tonight, so maybe that will tip me up to 2,500 calories. But the data center where I've been plugging into and has been consuming a huge amount of electricity, that's been consuming many kilowatts more than I've done. And yes, it's fantastically good at a very narrow set of things like crunching numbers. But yeah, it still can't tell the difference between, some breeds of dog and a chocolate muffin. So it's limited in so many other respects.
Okay, interesting. You said a lot of interesting things here. So let's quickly unpack. And so do you think, I don't think I've ever heard a technical AI practitioners mention these things, so that's interesting. So do you actually think that we are not necessarily amplifying, but it's just an extension? But don't you think that with the rise of, for instance, BCI or brain-computer interfaces, and we're seeing that recently with MindPong, Neuralink, and all of that, we increasing the journey to become more like a cyborg and using the power of computation with its high volume capacities to merge with our own biology and human capabilities. So that's that. And second, you've mentioned a few times, and I agree with you, the things that we don't necessarily talk a lot about, the energy consumptions needed to run these supercomputers and data centers, etc. And what are your thoughts on that for the longer term?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go over those in reverse order, because the whole brain-computer interface question is a big one. We could probably spend the rest of the conversation on. So, on energy. I think this is the kind of the dirty secret that nobody wants to talk about in the tech space. And so, I guess I've been thinking about this longer than many people, because I used to work in a bank, and in a bank banks. Essentially they do two things. They have a big, well-fortified hole in the ground where all the gold is stored, and no one knows where the key is kept. And certainly they never told me where the key was kept. But they're very good at protecting your money until they go bust, in which case you have a government that steps in. But we hopefully won't have that problem happen again. And they also do lots of fancy mathematics, which we call trading. And the fancy mathematics helps the bank and its clients make more money. And to do the fancy mathematics is basically like, it's like, a race. You're trying to do the fancy mathematics faster than the bank across the street. And actually the bank across the street is a little bit closer physically to the data, to the exchange where the data is coming from. And that, milliseconds makes such a big difference in terms of, the speed of the fancy mathematics that they can do. So they get a trading advantage, and therefore, they perform better. So what we do is we put our computers, not in our office, we put them in the exchange. So we're even closer still, and then they do the same thing. And so that everything in kind of the financial world is really about an arms race, about how can you do everything faster. And there's many ways that you can do that. You can use, the latest computer equipment. You can physically be closer to the data source. There's loads of ways of doing this. But the most effective way is to make sure that your software is as tightly written as possible so that it fits the silicon that you're running on it really well, like a hand fits a glove. You want us to be really, really tightly fitted. And the truth is that most of the software that we use every day is not particularly tightly fitted at all. So, Microsoft Windows is a pretty bad example. Your computer that you're using or your Mac that you're using is an incredibly powerful machine, but most of the time it's just wasting its energy, because the software that you're using hasn't been very well written for it. Now, there's lots of reasons and complexity behind that, but essentially, the biggest thing is that it's a lot easier, a lot less intellectually hard to write software so that it can be used across multiple different types of hardware, and you can edit it and you can change it. It's much easier doing that than it would be to write your software very, very tightly all the time for the particular silicon in front of you. But in a bank, there's the real fancy maths right at the core of the organization. You want to write that in such a way that it runs as fast as possible every single time. And that's a kind of core discipline. And so, performance is the key thing. But of course, performance and energy cost are kind of two factors which are intrinsically related. So while we don't measure algorithms in kilowatts in a bank, we are measuring it in terms of milliseconds, but essentially, it's the same function that you're applying. So thinking about the energy efficiency of models and algorithms has been something I've thought about for a very long time. And of course now, I work in a kind of more mainstream ML industry with, much more, much more different industries and different sectors I look at. I can see this problem occurring in many other places. So, the Met Office in the UK, who does all the weather forecasting, they've got a really significant supercomputer in a data center in Exeter. The limitation of that machine is simply the grid, the energy grid to Exeter. If you drive down the M5 to the Met Office, you'll see these really major power cables coming down, feeding, not just Exeter and Plymouth and the towns and villages of the southwest of England, but the Met Office supercomputer. That's one of the big things. So energy is increasingly becoming the boundary condition for machine learning. And people who talk about exponential growth get carried away a little bit on this question, because exponentiality and S-curves are identical until that inflection point is reached. And I believe that inflection point is coming if it hasn't already been reached. So what we will see essentially the exponential curve in reverse, where right now everything seems to be accelerating, but then everything starts to get a little bit slower and a little bit less better until actually we hit a limit point, and then things just simply don't improve. And there's many reasons why you might hit an S-curve, but energy cost is certainly going to be one. So anyway, this topic has been like something buried under the surface, been very unfashionable talking about it. I remember at a big AI conference about 2, 3, 4 years ago, there was a lot of people who were getting very excited about using AI to solve climate change. And, there's some great examples there of how you might want to think about that. And there's some really great people and some really good friends of mine who are doing some good work there. But the truth is, there's also a lot of AI which is an absolute waste of electricity. And so, my kind of question to that group at that conference, and I read an article afterwards, was, maybe to solve climate change, we need to be doing less AI. And this kind of idea of, maybe we should be more energy efficient with our computer, maybe a little bit more considerate when we use our computer, something which has been deeply unfashionable until 2 weeks ago when Elon Musk decided not to accept Bitcoin anymore at Tesla. And now suddenly this whole question of energy efficiency in computers now is now a mainstream newsworthy, issue. So the crypto markets are kind of falling over themselves to kind of think through this problem about energy efficiency and the carbon credentials of mining. And I think it's just a matter of time, and I think kind of weeks and months before the spotlight turns on the rest of us in the AI community as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like you, every day I read a lot of relevant news, whether it's MIT Tech Review, FT, you name it, and rarely you see headlines of things talking about kilowatts of algorithms. Never I've saw such a thing before. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. I guess, yeah, like you said, it's a sort of a dirty secret of the tech industry. So you've done a TED Talk, and maybe for our listeners, do you want like quickly to cover it and maybe tell us the steps to survive the AI automation and robotic revolution coming to us?
Yeah, run as fast as you can. No, I'm serious. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to do. The thing about doing a TED Talk is you obviously have 18 minutes, and I think I don't know what they do to you if you go over 18 minutes, but I think they just turn your microphone off or something. So you're told to be very strict on time, which you haven't been as strict with me, which means I can ramble a little bit more. But I guess it's good having a time focus because it really makes you think about your choice of words. But also, by and large, most TED Talks are not read from a script or an auto cue. They are spoken without a script, and so what you have to do is really kind of rehearse and practice and really think very carefully about what you're going to say, and hopefully you don't miss part of your argument on the day, and it makes sense to the people listening. So I'm going to do a much better job on that TED Talk by people listening to the recording than they are going to any version I'm going to do now. The main thing I really wanted to do, though, is give people a sense of hope, because for me, the problem in the tech industry is that people look quite simplistically that this industry is divided into utopians and dystopians, and I don't think it's as simple as that. I'm somebody who's very, very concerned about so many things that we're doing in the tech industry, and I write extensively. I do a lot of public speaking. And I have some very deep concerns. I run a business that tries to kind of shame and expose tech companies from, screwing some of these things up, and also non-tech companies from not putting the right governance in place. So, I spend like a significant part of my life worrying about this stuff. But I'm not a dystopian thinker. I'm not somebody who believes the killer robots are going to come and, kill us all, or, we're going to destroy the planet, or those sort of things. I mean, I think that we have a choice, and I think our choice is being thoughtful about our future, and the other choice is about dealing with unexpected consequences. And I think we have to think these things through more carefully. And at the moment, there's too much of an emphasis on innovation for the sake of innovation, technology for the sake of technology, and what we don't really think about is the impact this is going to have on us and our children and our grandchildren. And I want our species to be thriving on this planet and in space and across the universe for, not just the next 10, 30, 50 years, however long I'm going to be around for, but for the next 10, 30, 50,000 years and, longer still. And I think we're only going to achieve that if we're thoughtful about what we do. And maybe that means we're a little bit slower in making progress. But that doesn't mean I'm a dystopian thinker at all. And so for me, the challenge with that TEDx was, how do I talk about robotics and the impact of robotics on jobs? And by robotics, I mean software robots and physical robots, in a way that is positive and hopeful, but at the same time provokes change and helps people think about the consequences. And so when I was invited to speak, I was given a very simple brief, like I've just explained, which sounds like, okay, well, that's great. So, I mean, we've got 18 minutes to talk about a hopeful message about robots taking jobs. But actually, it's a little bit more difficult than that to get those things right and to get that balance right. So I'll let people judge for themselves whether they think I did or not. But for me, the key thing in the Tedx is to understand that the nature of AI and automation and robotics is, we are essentially copying ourselves in machines. We're replicating our own abilities in machines. And that just simply means that if we keep automating, we're playing a game of musical chairs. And we have to kind of think through the economic consequences of that. And UBI, which at the moment is the only answer which is being offered as a solution, has some critical weaknesses to it. And there are alternatives out there, but they are equally unattractive, like the Chinese social credit system. So we have to have this debate. And I think kind of final point on this is, I guess the most devastating thing for me is seeing that the leaders of the tech industry, people like Eric Schmidt, the former head of Google, they want to deny there's a problem. So most people in the tech industry, because they have a clear agenda, they want to just tell us, oh, don't worry, we're going to invent new jobs. It's all going to be fine. It was all fine in the past. It's all fine now. And I think it's great if they're right, and I hope they're right. But if they are in any way wrong, then the rest of us are, yeah. We have problems.
Yeah, totally. And I'm with you when you said that we should probably stop, not necessarily stop, but pause, think, act, and not just do tech for the sake of it or innovation for the sake of it. It's like, so recently, for instance, I was just reading the latest publication, magazine from the MIT Tech Review. It's all around smart cities and the future of cities. And, it's like many communities around the world, like Canada or other cities or other countries in which Google wanted to deploy the sidewalk. People thought, okay, can we pause a bit there? Do we actually need all this stuff? Maybe like provide us with, better housing or other actual tangible actions for the communities and people living in it. So that's interesting. So linked to that, and I guess the impact of technology. So we talk a lot about technological unemployment, so to speak, and it looks like in the near future, if not now, to be honest, you will have to retrain, learn new skills, change jobs, or rethink your long-term strategy. So in your views, how can we make, I guess, this sort of technological unemployment a positive outcome?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point is not to get too hung up on work and skills and jobs and any of those things, because my career, I've been relatively successful compared to a lot of people, and I've been very lucky compared to how my life could have turned out in many different ways. And, I'm very fortunate that, I've been given more opportunities than my parents had, and they've been very good to me in encouraging me to take those opportunities. And so, I consider myself someone who, despite the ups and downs that life brings, which it does, has been pretty fortunate. But I've been out of work. I've faced unemployment. I've experienced the kind of the lows of that and the fear and the uncertainty. And, I've got to say, 2009 was a pretty grim year for me. And I can really relate to people right now who, because of the pandemic, have find themselves through no fault of their own outside of employment. Because the thing that I remember very clearly of my own experience is you just don't know how long it's going to last. You're looking at your bank balance or, your overdraft once it gets really bad, and your bills and your credit card statements, and then you probably stop looking at them. You probably don't open the envelopes anymore once it reaches a certain point. That was certainly my experience. And then you just think, how long can I keep going for? How long is this going to take? And when every day the news is full of stories about businesses going bust and banks failing and government stepping in, and you just don't know whether is this going to be a few weeks, a few months, a few years, or forever. And that uncertainty eats you from the inside. And I've experienced that firsthand. And so for me, that experience was, I can now say, looking back on it, was a real blessing, because I can relate to people, and it is created for me a sense of urgency to help people through that. Because the work that I now find myself doing is maybe making that problem worse for more people, and I'm very conscious that I don't want to be causing those problems for other people intentionally, but I just simply don't see this magic jobs creation system that we're going to create. It's inevitable that people who today are doing certain roles are going to find those roles displaced by technology, and at least some of those people are going to find it very hard to retrain and reskill in the time that they have of their careers left. And I think what we need to do is accept that is actually maximizing full employment, maximizing a 40-hour working week for the sake of it is maybe not the smartest thing we can be doing. Instead, I think we should be maybe being a little bit more flexible on those parameters, on those goals, and making sure that people who are not working or not fully working have the ability to enjoy all the privileges of life that they deserve, and to take as much of the anxiety away from them as possible, and to encourage them to find as much purpose in the other activities that they spend their time doing as possible. I think those should be our focus points. So I think there's far too much time focused on skills, and I'm not saying there's not a skills crisis, because there is. It's really important that we start to teach kids a different blend of things at school. We think about the nature of work, not in terms of what the country needs this year, the next 5 years, but in the next 50 years, the next 100 years. But we have totally missed the opportunity to talk to people and kids about purpose in life, and helping people and kids, encourage them to realize that it's not something to be ashamed about to be unemployed. It's not something you should get too hung up on. If you're happy doing something else, being an artist, finding vocation, caring for a relative, just being a human being, then we shouldn't shame you into work necessarily, because that might have been a necessary tool 100 years ago, but it's not just a non-necessary tool now in the 21st century, but it's going to be counterproductive us doing that.
Yeah, totally. And earlier, Charles, I think you briefly mentioned, very briefly, your views on UBI, or Universal Basic Income. I don't have any opinion on it, because I didn't fully investigate, and read reliable resources. So I don't really have an opinion. So, but I'm curious to hear if you have any views on that, and why do you think that might not be the best idea long term?
Yeah. I mean, look, on the face of it, it seems like such a good idea. And I'm one of those people that when I first heard about UBI, I was really excited as this is something I could really, for so many years I was fell out of love with politics, because, people on the left and people on the right seem to kind of make the same arguments about the same things. And I couldn't really decide. And, for many years, it wasn't even clear where the left or the right was. And it was just a bit boring, frankly. And so I think for me, that period from, completing my studies through to, certainly the financial crisis was just this most dull and uninteresting period in politics, where I just didn't really follow what was going on. And then this idea of UBI I came across, and I thought this is really interesting, and, maybe as a future model, but I didn't really see the urgency of the problem that it was trying to solve either. So UBI, if you haven't come across it, Universal Basic Income, is essentially the idea that, everyone gets, money from the state for no reason other than simply because, we exist. And it, I guess if you're a recipient of that at a very simplistic level, it seems quite attractive. Maybe this idea of it's money for nothing. Maybe there'll be people who will say, well, hang on a second, that goes against all of our views in terms of, money should be an incentive for, you to work and be useful, contributing member for society. But maybe in a future where there isn't enough work to go around, maybe we need to rethink this. So this is kind of the problem that UBI is trying to address. There's arguments to say that simply giving money out would be cheaper than running a benefit system. I think there's arguments for and against that, but I think that's an interesting question. There's, also another part of the argument that says, well, there's simply never enough tax that you could raise to be able to pay the UBI check. So you'll be in this kind of constant inflationary cycle where you're kind of inventing new money. And I guess this is like the great, and this is probably way out of scope of this conversation for AI, but, like if you ask most people where does money come from, they'll really struggle to answer, the question. And the answer is money's just made up. Money's just invented. It's just, the central bank and the government decide amongst themselves how much money to create, and that's what gets created. And it sort of magically flows into the system, but there's no kind of intrinsic kind of control on money. There's no finite limit to money. Money is just something which is, magically invented. It has no substance to it. And I think that comes as a big surprise to most people. Again, something else which isn't really taught in school is, something which is so intrinsic to playing the game, to living in this world, to living in our society is money. And it's something which there's zero education about. And just on that, I mean, if you play any game like Monopoly, like I'm just thinking of Monopoly came to my head, but the first thing you do when you play a board game or you play a computer game is you try and get a sense of what the rules are. How do I play this game and how do I win? And how do I play fairly? How do I not cheat? How do I, and we live in a capitalist system where the basic principles of capitalism are not taught. It's just very bizarre. Anyway, that's an aside. So UBI on the face of it is very attractive. And basically the idea is that, we would then have the freedom to be able to spend the income that we get, this basic income that we get, on the things that we want to have. And therefore we don't have to work. I can pay for my rent and my food and my clothes and my whatever, and I have total freedom to spend my time drawing pictures or reading books or whatever it is I want to do. So on the face of it seems very attractive, but there's two problems to this. One problem is I've just mentioned I pay my rent and buy my food and my other things. So much of what we spend money on today is on a subscription basis. I have a Netflix subscription and a Spotify subscription and an Amazon Prime subscription, and I only have so much income coming in. So if I have a universal basic income of £100 or £200 a week, for example, then guess what? The Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are going to be thinking, how do we get that slice of the wallet? How do we get that share of the pie? And so, they're going to be competing amongst themselves to make sure that, they get that subscription and they find the clever way to lock you in. And as can you really give up your Dropbox subscription or your Netflix subscription? If you do, what does that mean? You lose your music collection, you lose your movie collection, you lose your photo collection. And that isn't just access to beautiful photographs, it's access to your photographs and your data. So that's probably going to be the last thing that you ever get rid of. So that was, again, my experience when I was flat broke. I would have given up anything but for my cloud computing and data subscription, because I did not want my data to be deleted. That was more important to me than anything else.
Or maybe because we can't live with that, the cloud. I don't know if you read this article from this famous journalist. I can't remember from which magazine she was from, but she wrote a personal experience, I think 1 or 2 or 3 months with that any use of cloud. And when I mean cloud, I mean even the infrastructure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Azure. That was, I need to send it to you. It's such a funny read. She felt miserable all the way through.
I mean, I'd say that's almost impossible now, even for someone like me who's quite extreme on these things. I've lived for over a year without a smartphone, so I'm trying to kind of live that kind of more digital, purist life. But, I mean, without cloud services is almost impossible.
Yeah. So I think you're familiar, Charles, with very famous author Yuval Noah Harari. You see where I'm going. Do you agree with him on? I think it was at the World Economic Forum. I can't remember where. I mean, it's everywhere. Regarding artificial intelligence and automation, he said that these will create, quote unquote, a global useless class. Do you agree? And what are your thoughts on all the things that you wrote around that?
Yeah, so I think there's a special spot in hell reserved for people like Yuval Noah Harari, and I think comments like that referring to people as being useless. I mean, I think he talked about humanity turning into two classes. And I think the quote was, humanity will become separated such that there'll be those who will be the gods and there will be those who will be the useless.
The rats. I think they mentioned as rats. If you hear the whole thing, that was pretty dystopian / scary. The rats. Oh, yeah. Okay, who are the rats of the society?
I just think that language is so unhelpful. But it comes with an intentionality to it. It comes with very deliberate provocation. And I think for me, there's people like Harari and Sam Harris. I think what most upsets me about them. I mean, for one thing, the books are great to read. They're really great writers and very skilled at what they do. And no surprise they've been so popular and so successful. But they're both. I think it's fair to say they're both charlatans in the sense that they're both trying to pretend to be something that they're not. So in Sam Harris's case, he pretends to be a philosopher when he's really a neuroscientist, but he's also, to the extent that he is a philosopher, and I don't want to claim that, philosophy and economics is quite funny. If you try and make any economic arguments, people who are trained as economists will say, you've got some really interesting opinions, but you're just not an economist, so therefore your opinions count for shit. Philosophers tend to have the same approach, and I definitely don't want to try and make that argument on Sam as well. But Sam makes some interesting philosophical points, but he's an evangelical atheist. And to me, taking away someone's God, destroying someone's God, taking away their faith, which I see as such a blessing, and I'm not a religious person, I'm not blessed with that gift myself, but I think to me that's one of the most despicable things you can do to another human being, because it's not conversion from one God to another or one way of life to another. He's gone out of his way to try and argue why God is an impossibility and why people who believe in it are just stupid. And I think that's just an ugly, ugly, ugly thing to do. And so people like Sam Harris, unfortunately, are celebrated within the technology industry. And when they create institutions called the Future of Life Institute to design our future world with AI, they're invited as the philosopher in the room. And I think that's a really big mistake. And Harari is kind of guilty of a very similar charge in that he masquerades as a historian, and he writes his books from a perspective of history, but he's not writing history at all. There's something very seductive about somebody who tells the story of how things were and then how things are becoming and then how things are today, because you can write this in such a way as to imply an arc, this kind of overarching theme, which is so inevitable. It's so out of control of your life, my life, our time, that there's no point in arguing against it. It's just the natural order of how things are. And Harari does this very strongly in his work. He's an evangelical transhumanist. He's somebody who has got a very, very strong agenda for promoting transhumanism, and he portrays it as a historical narrative. And I think that's deeply, deeply offensive to the rest of us. And you mentioned brain-computer interfaces earlier, which we didn't quite come back to. I mean, this idea of finding the balance between ourselves as natural, evolved creatures and the technology we create is really where this kind of question of transhumanism comes in. And there are those who would argue that merging with technology is a moral imperative. It improves our lives. It improves the conditions of the world. It may even somehow solve climate change and other macro. It might remove suffering and cure disease, and all of these reasons mean it just should be an imperative for us to do so. And those of us on the other side of that argument who would say, well, maybe we need to just stop and talk about this first. And unfortunately, the first time that you create an augmented human, the first time in the same way that you automate a job in such a way that there's no chance that a person is going to have an economic future, the first time you cross some of these lines, you fundamentally alter the nature of reality for the rest of us. And I think that's why it makes it so important. So Harari is trying to soften us up for this transhumanist ideal. And I just wish he was a little bit more honest about it. That's all.
Great. Thank you for sharing your views. So, yeah, it's interesting time, and I think bottom line, we should all apply critical thinking, right? Whether we're hearing or reading a book from a prominent writer, speaker, or super hyped persona out there, we should always apply critical thinking and dig and understand what's the hidden agenda there, maybe, yeah? So tell me about your ventures. You are involved in pretty cool projects, and I would love to hear more about the things you are currently working on, and maybe you can share with us some cool business cases that you led for your clients in the past.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm working on is very simple. If you're worried about technology, if you're worried about the kind of controls around technology and how this might go wrong, then you're not alone. We've thought about it as well, and the only difference between what we've done is that we've thought about it to such an extent that we're able to compare organizations against each other and provide some numerical data to highlight the differences. So if you want to know, let's say take self-driving car technology, whether Tesla or Toyota are the more ethical company in terms of the governance that they put in place and the controls they put in place and how well they've thought through the consequences, then we can tell you the answer to that. If you want to compare WeChat against WhatsApp, if you want to compare TikTok against Twitter, then that's exactly what we do. So we cover, still a drop in the ocean, 232 companies at the time of this recording. But every day we're looking at organizations, and we're really looking at a whole set of questions that we think are important about how an organization is thinking about the future. And those range from the energy efficiency of AI. I mean, we talked about that already. That's a topic for us that we think is really important. But also how an organization is thinking through automation. So if it's a manufacturing business that runs a factory and it's implementing robotics, what we're looking at is how is it thinking about its responsibilities to its workers, and maybe even more broadly than its workers, but to the communities of people that their factories are based in, and how is it thinking through this in a sort of not just the short term, but also the longer term. And we're evaluating and rating companies based on their considerations of this. And obviously, bias and discrimination of models is a key concern for so many people, as it is for us. But it's one of many factors that we look for. So that's what we do. And we think it's important. We know that the financial investment industry have value in this data. They want to understand the risks because they know all too well when a company gets this wrong, it impacts their investment. So when Cambridge Analytica happens, that took, I think, something like 15% out of Facebook share price. So that was a really shitty day if you were the investor in that company at the time. So we know investors care about this, and they pay us for our research and for our data. But we know that everyone else also has value in it. So we have a kind of strange model where we make all of our research and all of our data free. We publish it on our website on ethicsgrade.io. We offer journalists and academics a data feed so they can do their own research. Or we say to people from the finance industry, if they're using our data for making money, that they should pay us a small part of that for the privilege. So that's what we do. And I think what's great about this project is, we started in February 2020, so just before the old world collapsed and this new world of Zoom and what have you began. And thanks to that, we built a global team. We would never have been talking to people in Seattle and Los Angeles and, all over continental Europe and the UK. It would have been a much different type of vibe. And so we've been able to bring so much more diversity of viewpoints into our team. We've been able to build a much stronger team despite having never met each other. And I think what we've also been able to do is find people who really have a sense of passion for this as a project. And I guess I'm in my late 30s. I care deeply about the future. I care deeply about the issues of today. Social justice problems, upset me, and I want the world to be a more equitable place, not just for me and for you and for others listening, but for my kids and for their friends. And what I just continuously am so impressed by is literally everyone I meet who's younger than me gives a shit more than I do. And I think that gives me such amount of hope for the future that it's a great thing. So yeah, I love what I do, and I feel very fortunate to be finally doing something which is a hobby and a passion, and also I can call it my work at the same time.
That's fantastic. I'm really happy for you, Charles. And so, it's been a big week of, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can't remember, time flies. In terms of regulation and AI ethics in the EU. So I'm not sure if you follow up on that one, but any impact on your current business, and what are your views on the latest regulations that the EU published on AI rules?
Yeah. You're definitely asking. It's almost as if I didn't. If people were wondering, I didn't give you these questions to ask me, but you're asking me really good questions. So I know you've done your homework on what pushes my buttons. So yeah, like I missed GDPR totally. I totally missed it. I used to run a data analytics company. I sold it. I was doing some consulting work at the time. Someone mentioned GDPR and I said, what? And I read the rules and went, oh, that's interesting. But I really did not see how much of an impact that was going to have. And as I said earlier, like I said, Cambridge Analytica was like, this moment in time when people started to think about these questions. To me, that was like the hole in the ozone layer moment. That was the moment when people realized that tech industry had a dark side, but nothing really changed. GDPR was like the ban of CFCs. GDPR was this kind of moment when suddenly like a lot of things did change for a lot of organizations. But, even now, 3 years on, I'm sure that so many companies are not GDPR compliant, like truly. But there has been a huge improvement. There has been a big, maybe not in terms of consequence, but in terms of focus. So we slightly qualify that. So I totally missed GDPR in terms of the scale of impact it would have in Europe, and also I totally missed GDPR in terms of how much it would change things around the world. So in Australia and California and so many other places, we've seen kind of GDPR-like regulation taking place, and so it's kind of really set the sort of gold standard for everyone else to follow. And so knowing this, when I heard the new European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, talk about regulating the tech industry, creating a digital single market, and starting to think carefully about the regulation of AI within the first 100 days of her presidency, I sat up and thought, okay, this is real. And so that was middle of 2019, so it's nearly 2 years ago. Now, at the midpoint of 2021, what's going on? Well, think of it this way. GDPR is like the foundational layer. And for many people and many companies, they think that's the kind of the end of the story, the end of regulation in tech, but it's really just the beginning. And so at the end of last year, we saw three proposals from the European Commission. And last month in April, on the 21st, we saw 2 more proposals coming through. And collectively, we're looking at a very, very different digital ecosystem in Europe. And AI is a piece of this, but I think the wider context is also really important for people to understand. So the other pieces of regulation are the Data Governance Act, which looks at public data sources. So GDPR is really about private data, your personal data. The Data Governance Act is about public data sources, which could include medical data, for example, that's kind of in the public domain, and how that can be regulated and protected and used in an appropriate way, and the innovation that can happen around that. And that's really important. And I think the pandemic has taught us why we need to find the right balance between innovation around public and private medical data, but also environmental data and agricultural data, so many other places where this is critical for us to think through. So first steps are going on down that road, and again, that's the beginning of a story. Then we've got the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which really beat up the big tech companies on certain things. So it remains to be seen how much lobbying happens over the next couple of years and how much of the proposals finally make it into law. But, the things that the Commission are looking at are, is it okay for Amazon to be selling, furniture, and for them to get into the low-cost furniture business, and for them to be encouraging IKEA to be selling their furniture on Amazon, and then for Amazon to learn from all of the data as to which is the most profitable furniture line on Amazon, and for them to double down and make that furniture and put it at the top of the ranking so that they can divert most of the money towards their own product. And I think the Commission is very aware of that. Europe has got no real place in the kind of technology world, but we have got some really great, iconic organizations like Lego, like IKEA, that have global impact. And if we're not careful, then Amazon could destroy them. And so this idea that there needs to be some controls around digital marketplaces and gatekeeper organizations like Amazon, like eBay, like Spotify, like others, need to have a few rules, I think is really, really interesting. And maybe through the investment that the European Union is looking to do, we might even see the creation of ecologies of tech companies within Europe that might even start to compete with some of the American or Chinese players. And I know that sounds crazy, but we did it before. I say we did it before because we used to be in Europe, but they did it before with Boeing and Airbus. Boeing was in a position in the 1970s where it was really the only aircraft manufacturer because all of the other European ones had gone bust or been acquired. And, that's kind of the story of the technology industry in Europe. We don't have a domestic tech industry in the UK or the EU because so many tech companies are invested in, the exciting ones are owned by American VCs or been acquired. So there's that. The Digital Services Act is really about, the Digital Markets Act is about protecting the markets and the operation of the markets from those big players. The Digital Services Act is making sure that you can't gamify the rules when you do business in Europe. So people like Uber, they set up in Ireland or wherever, and then they're like, competing with taxi drivers in Paris. How a Parisian taxi driver is going to stop that when it's an app with no office in Paris, no people in France? How can they actually stop Uber from breaking the rules? Well, now the Digital Services Act is going to really make it much harder for companies like Airbnb or Uber from breaking those rules. And then it brings us to the AI regulation and the Machinery Directive. So these are really two pieces of the same puzzle. The Machinery Directive is more focused on embedded AI, so AI in an industrial context, robotics essentially. And then the AI Act is really mostly focused on software implementations. But essentially the principle is the same, that, when you buy a piece of electronics, it has that little CE sticker on the back of it to say it conforms to European safety standards. Well, for things which are deemed as high risk, AI systems that are deemed as high risk, they're going to have the same thing. And to get one of those stickers, to be allowed to put that sticker on your product or your software, you need to go through a set of steps. And while the criteria aren't necessarily crazy exciting in terms of what the Commission's asking for, it's at least the first step down a road that means that the free-for-all that we've seen around technology will be stopped. So is it going to make the world a safer place? Yeah, and it's definitely going to mean that every tech company in Europe is going to have to think twice about what they're doing.
Wow, super cool overview. And I guess that's the regulation part of this puzzle. And in regards to AI ethics guidelines, do you think that we need some new kind of global ethics guidelines? I'm saying that because some people argue in the industry that currently AI ethics guidelines are driven, it's black and white, so it's either Western stuff or Eastern countries taking the lead, and that ultimately then the guidelines basically illustrate the regional values of the countries. So for instance, maybe in the West we could argue that we value more things such as respect for autonomy and the rights of individuals, and in other regions of the world, that's different. What are your views on that? Do you think that we should have a more cohesive, homogeneous approach? Because at the moment, at least it looks like, I lived in China, and they have other ways of operating over there in that part of the world. We have our own ways of operating. You have, OpenAI, for instance. I think every year or so they gather in the US. They're driving the agenda, in the four walls in Silicon Valley. But we're all different here. I think we need probably to sync up a little bit more, no?
Yeah, I agree. I think with part of that. I'm not sure I agree entirely, and I'll explain why. So I read an article today, funnily enough, on kind of this topic, which is this topic of having ethics imposed on us by a group of people that have a very different set of norms. And I was really referring to a specific example of politeness and chatbots. And so, this is old news. This is not something new, but Google and Amazon have both put in sort of incentives into the software that if you say please and thank you to the Google Assistant or the Amazon Alexa, then it responds differently, and it's designed to game mostly kids, frankly. It's designed to condition kids into being more polite to seriously, who gives a fuck? It's a robot. It's a machine. It's like I can swear at it, I can shout at it, I can hit it with a hammer. It's a machine. And it really upsets me because as a Brit, as somebody who, politeness and like the kind of etiquette of saying please and thank you is so deeply ingrained in my cultural heritage, it offends me because the reason that I say please or thank you to somebody who works for me, for example, somebody who I employ, and therefore they kind of have no choice. I mean, they could quit their job, but they kind of have no choice to the order. I phrase it as a request, and I add a please and I add a thank you. And the reason that we do that, I think, and this is not necessarily a British thing entirely, but the reason that the British, I think, is so particular is because we're also so hyper class conscious. We're so paranoid about the kind of the class hierarchies that we've had much more rigid in the past, but we still have today. And therefore, we're trying to kind of pretend that there is no distinction between people. There's no distinction between status. And we're trying to introduce those words of please and thank you in order to kind of level a playing field. But really, it's about acknowledging that the other person has autonomy. The other person has agency. And so when I ask you something and say please, it really, even if it's an order, even if I'm really, even if the context makes it clear that I'm giving you no choice, when I go home and I say to my son, can you give me can you pour me a glass of water, please, or can you give me that toy, please? He really hasn't got much choice in that question. But I phrase the please because I'm at least, trying to acknowledge his agency. But a machine has no agency at all. And I think it's very dangerous that we try to create this illusion that they have agency. And I guess, what I was playing with this article is this idea that by actually being much more rigid about this and much more rigorous about our refusal to acknowledge the agency of machines, maybe actually we are, in doing so, reinforcing our own freedom as human beings, and I think there's been plenty of articles in the past written about why we should treat robots as slaves and why we should treat machines as slave-like entities. There's been a lot of criticism of people who've tried to make this connection because of the language is so emotive, and I think it's obviously a delicate topic, but I think that that's where the debate needs to happen. We need to start thinking about, do we really want to create pieces of silicon and plastic that we want to pretend are our friends, or are they just tools that they need to do what we tell them to, and if they don't, they get sent back to the manufacturer and reassembled? And I think that's the kind of a key thing. And so this is the point. It's a group of people in Silicon Valley or in Seattle who are essentially interfering with the development of my very, very English childhood here in the UK, because they haven't thought through this issue at all. They just think it's cool to be able to make the toy say please, and it responds in a different way. So there's a long answer for me saying that I think regional difference, cultural difference is so important. And this is one of the problems the tech industry has, is the fact you've got Facebook with 3 billion users or thereabouts, and they are trying to kind of find a consistency in how they treat those 3 billion people. And that's hard. I accept that's hard, but just because it's hard doesn't mean that it gets them off the hook, that they need to think through these issues. And I really don't believe that you're going to be able to. I think there's some things that we could all agree on. I do think there are some things we can all agree on. Fundamental human rights, I think, is something which there is a universal standard on. And thankfully, we have organisations like the UN who've promoted certain things as sort of agreed upon goals for us as a species and us as a collection of societies, because we're not really one society, we're many societies. But even within that agreement, there's still criticism of, people in China or, other parts of the world, because of what happens in terms of how those ideas are inconsistently applied around the world. And I think it's going to take a very, very long time for us to, agree on a longer list of things that we can all agree on. And so I think if we're sitting around waiting for a universal set of ethics, I think we're going to be waiting for a very long time. I think the smarter thing for us to do is to really question the scale of some of the technology companies, because unless they're able to really build a kind of cultural what's the right word I'm looking for? Cultural respect in their products. If they're not able to do that when they have 3 billion users, then they shouldn't have 3 billion users. That's my view.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you said around that the machines and robots don't have any agency, or we shouldn't, I guess, create sort of personification around them. I think the OECD actually a few years ago, they wrote some principles around AI accountability, and that's one of the principles was around that creators or humans should be the responsible agent, and not the machine. If I believe, because I attended CogX, you probably know this big festival in London, and I remember I've attended the AI ethics keynote.
CogX is great. It's done a great job of promoting a lot of the risks and the benefits of AI and raising awareness for these things. But the problem with OECD, the OECD is kind of there's going to be a lot of people who are going to hate me after this podcast. So I really should be more careful what I say. Look, the OECD is like seen as being some sort of global organization that champions. It's not. It's a club for the West. It's a club of Western Western countries that kind of agree on kind of economic cooperation. So it's first of all, it's not a set of universal human standards. But I think it's seen as such, and I think the OECD members and people kind of encourage that. And so I think it's deeply offensive, for example, to many people in China or Chinese companies, the fact that they haven't been included in some of these things. And look, China's got its problems, don't get me wrong, and we have a difficulty at the moment with China in the West. But doesn't make all Chinese people or Chinese companies evil or wrong or twisted. And I think we really need to be careful if we're creating principles like what GPI have done through the sponsorship of the OECD, and we need to be much more. I think we need to be much more conscious of trying to be more inclusive of countries like China in that process. I think that's one thing. And the second thing I would argue is that there's just not much utility in principles. I mean, look, the problem is the people on the ground who are building this stuff and selling this stuff or marketing this stuff. They're the ones that are facing the challenges. And I was talking to a company today, which is I won't I don't want to say too much about them because I don't want to get sued, frankly, but they've got a lot more expensive lawyers than I have. But also, I think they're genuinely trying to grapple with this issue, and I think it would be unfair for me to, call them out as they're really at the early stage of working these things through. But they're selling technology, and they're selling that technology in Europe and the United States and around the world. But they particularly see emerging markets as being a great opportunity for them in Africa and Asia and South America. And but what they're realizing is that when they're selling their technology, they're gonna set some principles and they're gonna set some central rules. But then when it comes down to what's going on the ground, a salesperson might have a target. A salesperson might have a quarterly bonus, and they might have a family to feed, and they may decide that yes, they know this technology is going to be used for the wrong thing, but going to get my bonus this quarter. So how do you translate? I mean, that's kind of like maybe an obvious mismatch, but there's lots of examples where only later do people say, well, hang on a second, that use of the technology isn't okay, or that particular solution isn't okay. And how do you prevent that from happening? And the only way you can do that is to be very specific and very tied to what goes on on the ground. And so my problem with all of these principles is that, and I've been in these meetings, what happens is you get 20 important people in a room for 90 minutes, and you get them all with a bunch of post-it notes to agree on the 6 or 7 least offensive words. And guess what? We all come up with the same thing: fairness, equality, justice, etc. And it kind of doesn't mean anything. Doesn't really help anyone on the ground. And so, I don't want to belittle the efforts. There's a lot of good work that's been done in thinking this through, but there's also a lot of lessons that can be learned from other industries. And I think we could get to the shortcuts much faster. These problems have been solved before in the medical industry, in the biotech industry, in the financial services industry. Business ethics and medical ethics are not new topics. And I think in digital ethics, we could learn so much just from asking the right questions of those other professionals. How do they make sure that practitioners on the ground get this right, and we have some common common themes to head for, and there are answers to this, and we like to think that we're inventing the wheel for the first time, sadly, always.
That's interesting what you're saying. And so talking about all things digital and change and how we can, I guess, take inspiration from other verticals that have successfully, built strong ethics across all their projects. Looking at, for instance, at social media platforms, I think was it on DFT? I can't remember. I think I read an article written by you actually on foresight and not oversight. Do you want to expand a bit more on that? I think you had a pretty good opinion on it.
Yeah, I think. I think what it was in relation. That article was in relation to the oversight board and the Trump decision, and I think the Facebook oversight board. I mean, I kind of feel sorry for them because they can't do anything right, it seems. And I've been a vocal critic of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook for a number of years, since it was even unfashionable to do that. So he was like Time Person of the Year in 2011, and you couldn't really talk about Facebook in a negative sense back then, but and get away with it because people were couldn't see how it was in any way wrong or malign. But despite that, they've done an enormous job in the last few years. I mean, okay, they've had to, but they have done an enormous job thinking through at a level of rigor about this problem. And I only have really one criticism of it. They spent $120 million on this oversight board. They filled it with, okay, I have two criticisms of it. I've thought of another one as I'm talking. They filled it with the great and the good, and I think that's probably a criticism. They probably need a few more people at the grassroots. I don't mean people like me. I mean people who are affected by the issues. I mean, if you've hired the kind of, ex-prime minister of wherever, they're not going to be necessarily understand what it's like to be trolled because of how you look, or because of what you eat, or because of the color of your skin, or for whatever thing that ordinary Facebook users suffer from. They might know what it's like to be trolled by being in the public eye, but they usually have a team of people around them to protect them from that stuff. So it's a little bit different. So I think they need a little bit more grassroots representation. That's definitely a criticism. But otherwise, I think it's pretty well thought out, pretty well engineered. And they've got some really good quality people working on the problem. The only problem I have is really the scope of it is very narrow. They're looking at a very narrow set of issues like content moderation on Insta and Facebook, and they're not looking at the business model more holistically. And so, my comments earlier about, Facebook's problem is it's got 3 billion people. It's my absolute belief that, so many of the problems that Facebook have, so many of the reasons that Facebook is a force for ill in the world is simply because you can't have that scale and be, sorry, I'm just middle of a storm, so my microphone's probably picking up a bit of rain.
Yeah, I can hear that. That's a lovely, good atmosphere.
It's Mark Zuckerberg sending his his appreciation for my good comments. You can't. I don't think you can be so successful in terms of the number of people you have on your platform, and at the same time avoid the harms that causes at the same time, whether it's hate speech, whether it's propaganda, whether it's proliferation of obscene content, whatever it is. I think there's some of those problems are just intractable, and I think if the oversight board was given a little bit more latitude, a little bit more scope, they would think very creatively about how Facebook itself might need to be broken up into smaller organizations that compete against each other in order to, and that would resolve some of these challenges. And so what's what I mean about foresight is actually some of these things are very predictable. The idea that someone is going to do really horrendous things on a live video stream is kind of predictable. And so I think, the oversight board needs to be more conscious of that. And then the other idea I offer in this article, and this is, this is another kind of example, is that there's only really one organization that's managed to achieve this, in my view, and that's the Wikipedia organization. So, the difference between a wiki and social media, though, is that, we all have control of the content. So I could go onto the Wikipedia article of, Donald Trump, and I could, change it. I could make it sound like he's a much more impressive person than it says, or I could make it sound like he's a total fool, or however I wanted to portray him. I could do that. I could do that now. But there's no incentive for me to do that because I know that somebody else will come and edit it. So Wikipedia is always focused on the facts because there's always that massive disincentive for you to change what's on Wikipedia, because changing it would be pointless. Somebody else would just come and delete what you've done. And I could just imagine that, maybe social media could look the same. Maybe, we all see so many tweets and LinkedIn posts and Facebook articles and Insta pictures that are just frankly like a lot of shit, really. And maybe people would think twice if they knew that I could just come along and go, yeah, delete. And I think, you wouldn't have somebody, gunning people down on a live video stream if the first person to see that who was sickened by it could literally just press the stop button. That stop button took them out of the video feed instantly. But at the moment, the way that's set up is, if you see something like that, you hit the kind of remove, block, this is obscene content. It then goes into a queue for a bunch of people to then get around to looking at after they've looked at all the other sick videos. And of course, you've got an AI algorithm that's trying to kind of figure out the worst stuff and put the worst stuff at the top of the queue, etc. But, while that's happening, there's still tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are sharing it, liking it, commenting on it, down-liking it, whatever. And that's just encouraging the algorithm to propagate it to more and more people. And so I think the whole premise of social media itself might also be something that we should think about. And if we had a wiki-based system, we would have a lot less noise in our lives. But of course, maybe Zuck would make less money, and maybe that's why he doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, keep me posted because trust me, I'm the same. I have my own website. I'm a bit like Jaron Lanier. I've built my own ecosystem. And I have LinkedIn. That's it. And actually, funny enough, I was a bit like you when Facebook was first launched. I think I was 18 or 19 or something, and I remember I just stayed a few weeks, and then I thought this is BS. I'm out of here. You won't have my soul. And I never looked back. And I'm 31, and my life is pretty goddamn good, with these platforms. Anyways, sweet. Charles, I wanted to ask you, do you have any thoughts on, obviously it's super, it's out there. I mean, the digital passport, everybody's talking about it. I have no views on it yet. I'm a bit boring, I think, today, right? I'm like, I have no opinion. I need to dig more again because I'm sure there's pros and cons. What are your views on digital health passports and data?
Yeah. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to have some sort of certification scheme because people are going to walk around claiming that they've been vaccinated when they haven't, or we're going to figure out at some point how long the vaccine is valid for. So maybe maybe you need to prove that when you have the vaccine, so you can prove that you're still safe to walk around, or it's time for you to have another one. So I mean, there's lots of good reasons why a certificate of some kind is necessary. I guess for me the problem is it's around digital inclusion and digital exclusion. So I mentioned earlier I've sort of started to remove myself from tech in some cases where I thought it was maybe more harmful to my life, and also as a bit of an experiment to see to what extent you can live without certain parts of technology. And I think living without the cloud is still a step too far for even me. But living without a smartphone has been a really interesting experiment. And it's actually a little bit easier where I live than for most people because I don't have cell phone reception where I live. So frankly, my cell phone is just a very small computer that's not as convenient as my laptop. So I've been able to kind of keep it in the car and only use it when I go out, and that's just meant I've been slower responding to people's text messages, which means they send me less text messages. And eventually, after a year, all my communication is on Slack and email. And, the people that need to know my landline have my landline. So I still talk to who I want when I want. So that's kind of me. But it's really also made me realize that there's this kind of there's this big problem where it comes to finding tech solutions to these questions. And it started for me when the contact tracing app was launched last year, which seemed like a great idea, except it required, on the Apple platform, a version of iOS that my little old iPhone doesn't support anymore. And really I was kind of facing this choice of like the only way to download the new contact tracing app would be to buy a new iPhone. And that's like, £1,000. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep my old one because it still runs, it still does what I need it to do. And I think this is for me is the biggest problem, is when you're starting to introduce apps as being the only way to mediate real world issues, and when you're requiring technology to be able to do that. And so there's this massive obsession right now with upgrading to the latest software. And it's just like the most gigantic conspiracy, and it's total BS. What they tell us is that you need to upgrade the latest software because there's lots of really bad hackers and cyber criminals out there, and if you don't do it, then they're going to exploit the vulnerabilities in the software, and you'll lose your data and what have you, and that's all bad. I mean, the only reason that there are those vulnerabilities in the software is because it's been so badly written in the first place. So maybe they should do a better job of writing it properly from day one. But also, secondly, what they do is when they issue a software update, they don't just fix the vulnerabilities. They also add a whole bunch of features. And you can't separate between the two. You can't do a software patch that's only focused on the vulnerabilities and not on the features. And of course, with some operating systems, like some of the Linux ecology, that's exactly what you can do. So you can be running an old version of Linux from, many years ago, still run the latest software because you're on an old computer, because you're only updating the critical patches and not just adding to the bloat of the features. But of course, in the consumer device market, they don't do that at all. And so there's really no technical reason why an iPhone 4, I mean, I know people can't see this, but, here's my little iPhone. It's an iPhone 4. It's 10 years old this year. I should make it a cake or something. But look at it. It's perfect. It's like not even scratched.
Wow.
It's been so well looked after over the years because it's, it cost me, what did it cost me? It cost me like £500-600 when I bought it. It's an expensive piece of technology and I've looked after it. It's traveled the world with me and it's been a great little companion in my world adventures, and it works just as good as the day it was new. Why? Because I've never updated the software on it. It's still running the same software as it came out of the iPhone store. But unfortunately, I can't use any apps on it anymore because none of the apps that I want to use are compatible. And this is, I think, a real problem. But there's no technical reason why the NHS app couldn't have been written for the iPhone 4 or indeed the original iPhone. And I'm sure there's not many people still with iPhone 4s, let alone original iPhones. But I think the principle is such that why should I have to upgrade my technology? Why should there be essentially an Apple tax or a Google Android tax to force us to be buying the latest? That's essentially what it is. A digital vaccination certificate passport is basically saying to all of us, if you want to lead a normal life, if you want to travel, if you want to go to a sports event or go to a pub or a restaurant, you have to be carrying a piece of very expensive glass and plastic in your pocket that was bought in the last 5 years from one of a small number of companies. Otherwise, you're going to not have the right freedoms. And I just don't understand why we're falling into this trap. And so, look, paper has its problems. I'm not saying that paper is the answer to everything, but I think we should be thinking about if we can't deliver a universal digital system, then we need to be thinking about a paper-first system. And I think that's a real moral point. But we're falling into this trap so many times. And let me give you one example of something that happened to me yesterday. And I'm currently in conversation with Microsoft about this. So, we're talking on Skype right now, but, I'm spending most of my time talking on Zoom. If not Zoom, I'm using Teams. So that's kind of my variety in my life is across those three platforms. The great thing about Zoom is that you don't actually have to have an account. I have an account with Zoom. I pay them. In fact, I have a paid account, but you don't have to have an account in order to be able to join a Zoom call. I think that's one of the best things about it. And also the great thing about Zoom is that even if you're running an old version of Zoom, they don't make you upgrade to join a call. You can be running quite an old version of Zoom and still join calls. I'm sure there's limits to that, but I think Zoom have been pretty good. Whereas the number of times I've joined a Teams meeting where I've had to literally download the latest version of Teams before I'm allowed in to join that meeting, this has driven me absolutely nuts. But the thing that's driven me totally wild in the last day is I was due to join a Teams call yesterday with an investor. Really important meeting. I've been planning for it for a few days. I was really excited. And I ended up having to email this guy and say, look, I'm really sorry. Can we switch to Zoom? And that was wasn't a great first impression. And the reason for this was because when I went to log into Teams, I suddenly, because of the latest software update, Microsoft have introduced two-factor authentication into the process. So what that means is not only do I have to log in with my email address and password, but I now have to provide the SMS code that they send me via SMS. Now, for one thing, I don't really want to give Microsoft my cell phone number. That's like the first point. They've got my email address. That's kind of enough. But now they want my cell phone number. So that's like the next kind of level of intrusion. But, I do have a cell phone still. But the other problem I have, as I mentioned earlier, is I live somewhere where there's no cell phone signal. And so for me to do two-factor authentication on Teams literally means that I have to go into the car, get my phone, because my phone stays in the car. It's not actually charged. So I'm going to have to charge it up, put like 10 minutes of charge in. Then I'm going to have to come back to my machine, do the two-factor authentication, then I have to run up the lane to the end of my lane, where the top of the hill I can get a signal. And then I have to run back to the house, and hopefully the two-factor authentication hasn't expired by the time I've done that. That's not fun at all for me. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that lives in a rural place that two-factor authentication by SMS is a total pain in the ass.
Totally. But hey, so, it's a bit of a maze, but hopefully things will change for the better. We'll see if they introduce some sort of paper version of authentication for people that do not wish to spend £1 on a shiny new iPhone. But I always ask this question Charles, and I'm conscious of time, and thank you so much for the great insights and time that you gave me today on the Mind Narrative podcast. What are the skills and or character traits that helped you so far in your life?
Oh my goodness, that's a question I wasn't expecting. What are the skills and character traits that help me in life? I don't even know where to start with this answer. I guess I've tried to keep an open mind. I know I've got strong opinions, and you want me on this podcast to be as opinionated as I can be. So I have very strong opinions, but I think keeping an open mind is one of the most important qualities we all need to do. And so I guess I always try and balance that. I always try and form strong opinions in terms of what I do, because I think having that focus is so useful in order to achieve change. But I think at the same time, having an open mind and being open to new ideas and being open to criticism is also a really good, strong way of increasing the quality of the work that you do. And for me, like, one of the ways I do that is I just read. Like, I read so much, and it's kind of funny because I trained to be a lawyer, and the reason I realized very quickly that I didn't want to go into the legal profession was there was just too much damn reading needed. And now I spend probably more of my life reading than an average lawyer would. So I guess you could be careful what you wish for. But that's what I would recommend, to anyone who's interested in the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of quality is to not be too hung on your own ideas. Have your own opinions. Make sure they're true to your convictions, but always keep an open mind.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, it's been very enjoyable for me as well. So thank you for indulging me. And if anyone's still listening, thank you for listening through all of this.
No worries. Well, thank you so much, and come back anytime to the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the near future as more regulations and life events happen in the tech world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Mind Narrative podcast. If you enjoy the content, we welcome your support by contributing on Patreon. Find out more at mindnarrative.co.uk. Bye.